So I'm going to go back to questions of economics and infrastructure. And I hope that makes sense, right? Like I hope that it's clear to even individual students or individual staff or faculty members that these are collective questions. These are not individual questions, and they determine what we learn, what we can teach, what kind of institutions we have. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions that we didn't get to ask when we went online. First of all, I don't know who decided to invest in licenses instead of public infrastructure. You can see the numbers if you go back up to the economics slide, right, of how much it costs per person, per license per month. For every institution, and if you get 1,000 licenses, that's about 250 to 280,000 euros a year, right? And if you get more, depending on what your size of your institution is, you can easily come up to like €1 million a year just for Zoom, right? And that's a huge expense, right? And the moment Zoom drops out of the market, or the moment you understand that Zoom is not sufficient for what you need for your educational infrastructure, that 1 million has just disappeared. There's nothing left of it, right? It's a license, and you stop paying for it, everything disappears. So why have universities decided to invest in licenses instead of public infrastructure? Obviously, there was a time issue, like we were expected to go online in 1 or 2 weeks, but why was that expectation there? And I understand it's, a difficult decision to make. People want to have their degrees, they need to start working. People have scholarships, that funding is going to end. There's lots of pressure. But the cost of that pressure and responding to it by buying licenses instead of developing a public infrastructure is literally burning money on companies that are not accountable to the university. So I think we need to have a longer discussion about using open source tools and open standards and building our own infrastructures. And the other thing that people don't understand, so if we go back to the economics of Zoom, is that as pressure comes on them to make up for the costs or to make up for their valuation in the markets, they're going to put pressures on universities. So why should a university subject itself to the pressures of the cloud markets when it could be independent also economically? And we already talked about like practice and tools. So why should you use a tool that is very hard to change? You can't even get them to respond to Zoom bombs properly, right? Like why not, pick tools that maybe are more appropriate to the culture of your organization and also tailor them to your needs and the needs of your students? And why not develop internal tech support that carries institutional values and culture instead of, relying on Zoom support, which is, an exploited call center probably in the Philippines or something like this, where apparently, like this is the latest I heard, they have become vectors of contagion in those countries, right? And so I think there's lots of questions here that seem, again, very subtle, but have global and local implications for the university. So what also happens with going online is all of a sudden, the tools that we use to conduct our learning is decided by a centralized entity. This might not be the case, right? Like, as I said, some of the professors in my institution moved to gaming platforms just on their own device. We started a free software installation of Big Blue Button, but all of a sudden there are questions about liability. What happens if something goes wrong? Who takes care of it? So you can see the whole question about online learning to be also a sort of centralization of power in universities to decide what kind of tools we use to educate, what kind of experimentations we're willing to do as an institution, who's going to take the liability for that, and how, so to say, third parties like Zoom and other companies start to determine what are the risks we're allowed to take and what are the experimentations we're allowed to do. So I think there are some questions to be asked here about whether online education will intensify centralization of control in educational institutions like ARTES, whether it will come to infringe on academic freedoms, and how, for example, maybe professors or instructors or students start getting worried about what kind of experiments they might want to do, which they might be easy to do in a space on the campus or in classroom, but now they might be less likely to do given both the surveillance infrastructure, but also the liability that comes with using these tools. And it's also important to remember that once you invest into these tools, it looks like you're in control, right? Like you decided to use a tool, right? Like professor decides to use a tool, or a student decides to use a tool, or the university IT decides to use a tool. But we forget that the economics, the political economy of where these tools come from has a very specific agenda, which is that they need to expand. And to expand, they need to hollow out institutions and replace them with the services that they offer. So we call this unbundling of institutions. So online educational companies have an interest in hollowing out parts of the university and keeping the university online. Zoom is a large company with 300 million users that has an interest in keeping the university online, right? And this is different from we need to be online because, contagion and epidemics and what have you. This is a kind of market interest that is pushing for us to remain online. And we need to remember that universities now have had a test run on where they can cut costs if they go online. So we understand better, or the administration will definitely have looked at their books and see, oh, those things were expensive and look how much money we, saved by going online. And at the same time, they have spent all this money through licenses. They will continue to do that. And this is a really big hit, they're losing international students, right? And we have to remember, unfortunately, especially in the Western world, international students have been seen as a kind of source of extracting value all the way in the UK, for example. They'll openly say it was about cross-subsidizing research. And in many others, it's like, recovering costs of different kinds. So, kind of middle class or well-off international students have been paying universities, and that model is breaking down as we speak. It's especially breaking down in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, which is, an important part of both academic and artistic production. And we will see a lot of universities collapse in the coming 2 years. And on top of it, we have an economic downturn that's probably upon us as well, which will determine how much public funding comes to these universities. So what I think a lot of universities are thinking about is, can I maybe get revenue by keeping my courses online, keeping my instructions, or keeping some of my facilities and services online and expanding online courses? Would this be a direction to go, right? And I think, I even see this among my colleagues. This doesn't have to be like evil administration. They're like, oh, we already recorded the course. We could just reuse it next year, right? Like, so it seems like a very pragmatic decision to make. But I thought I would take like an appropriate title for this, and I would say going online is a losing game, kind of a reference to the Eurovision that didn't take place. But song contest, Eurovision song contest, right? Like, anyways, so what will probably happen if universities think that they can compete online is that as soon as they make that decision, they enter the market of online education. That means, on the one hand, entering the market as competing with already very well-known and well-branded universities. So all of a sudden, Artes will be competing with CalArts, if that was possible, right? Like, and guess who will pay how much for which brand, right? So all of a sudden, you will have universities that are running on brand and market structures rather than, location. And you have to remember, a lot of international students come because of the location, partially to get visas, partially because they want the cultural exchange, etc. So all of that you lose, and now you're going to compete on the grounds of what, right? It's a brand. And that's one market that's really hard to win on. And the second one is the service infrastructure. Again, clouds, they always will look cheaper than doing yourself your own infrastructure or keeping things physical, right? And the reason they can do that is because of the investor money in the background, the kind of promise of the markets. So once you go online, it's always going to be cheaper to do more and more things online, which again is the hollowing out of these institutions, of educational institutions. So under these conditions, no name or smaller name, fringe academic institutions are going to struggle unless they become very elite organizations of some sort. They somehow create some sort of eliteness. But somebody I spoke with who said, I was at the Open University before, and when MOOCs came, we struggled, right? And so it's really hard for universities to go online and win in this two dimensions of branding, unless they're one of the top elite universities that everybody wants to be branded with, or they can somehow keep their costs low, given that the online services will be cheaper than doing whatever they do themselves. So keeping an independent institution is going to be very, very difficult and expensive, and going online is going to be a losing game. So it's going to be a hard decision no matter what these institutions decide to do.